would like now to kindly invite my co-chair to introduce the first speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not co-chair.
And my co-chair is Professor Ilyas Baidoun.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be with Professor Muhammad Hassan Ali here. I just add to his remarks. I would like really to thank the chair of this university, chair of the board, and the president of the university, giving me the chance today to be among us two in this very important forum. I am pleased that I was given also the privilege to introduce three eminent speakers here. And I would like to start with the first speaker, talking on providing science advice to governments. Our eminent speaker is Professor Zarki Abdul Hamid, the science advisor to the Prime Minister at Mauritius. Please join me in welcoming him. Here, I think. Next to me here.
Okay, all right.
I think 30 minutes is given, sir, for every speaker to be on time.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, co-chairs. Chairman Dr. Abu Bakr, President Mustafa Al-Taib, distinguished members of the Board of Trustees of Future University, distinguished academics from FU and maybe some from Khartoum itself. I'm very pleased and delighted to be here and to deliver on a topic which many of you from the universities may not think it's relevant. But I'm going to make a case this afternoon that it is very relevant and necessary. Of course, if you are in a university setting, the first thing you wanted to do would be to be promoted as a professor. For that, definitely teaching is one of your roles. Secondly, of course, doing research and development. And thirdly, to publish in peer-reviewed journals. So the last one, your publication record, is very crucial, that you have a good record so that you get promoted to an associate professor and a professor at the university. So in some ways, you would feel insulated, that you can be in your comfort zone, in your ivory tower, being a professor and mixing with your peers. My talk today is trying to provide you with a different take to the role of an academic. And in other words, it's really in the realm of public advocacy, meaning based on your expertise as an academic, as a scientist, social or natural scientist, you, to me, has an obligation to contribute to your society, whether it's local, in Khartoum, whether it's national, the whole of Sudan, regional, the whole of Africa, globally, the whole world. So that is the order of the day. And in fact, if you look at the records of the Board of Trustees of the Future University, you'll see that many of us have graduated into that, public advocacy and contribution. The second question I'd like to pose to you is the relevance of your expertise. It is true, knowledge building is one of them, but in this topic here today, I would argue your relevance also relates to how you could contribute towards making this a better place, a better country, a better continent, and a better world. So let me touch on the next issue here, and that is providing science advice to governments. Governments may translate into a national government. It can also translate into the global scene. My example is from Malaysia. What I would like to do is to explore the interface between science and public policy formation from the perspective of the policymakers. Here, the policymakers are really our political leaders. That is the relevance. And I can speak from experience because I've been the science advisor to the Prime Minister of Malaysia for 5 to 6 years now. To the politician, it doesn't matter if you can provide the theoretical basis to a particular problem. The politician is not really interested in that, at least mine, you know. When I first stepped in my role as the science advisor, he reminded me 2 requirements that is expected of me. Can your science advice create jobs for the people? Science, technology, and innovation must provide jobs. Okay? So in fact, in some ways, I'm really glad the second speaker today, I'm not sure you're going to touch on that, but from your intervention at the Board of Trustees meeting today, there's one element that he mentioned, that graduates should not only be job seekers, but should also be entrepreneurs, creating jobs. Secondly, for a country, any country like Malaysia, I think Sudan is no exception. Science, technology, and innovation to the policymakers, to the politician, should be an engine for economic development. And when I say science here, it includes the social sciences and humanities. Yeah? So, at least in my part of the world, the science policy interface has been elevated to quite, if not the highest level. We have a strong and direct interaction with the leaders of the country. This example is the APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Caucus. In one meeting of the Chief Science Advisor and equivalent, the Prime Minister addressed the gathering and listened to us. So, ladies and gentlemen, the realm of science and policy has increasingly been gaining in importance. And these are some recent international developments. One of the very well-known case of the science policy interface that has been effective in transforming policy making is, of course, the Intergovernmental Platform on Climate Change, the IPCC, yeah, which addressed the problem of global warming and eventually stirs the world, the UN and countries, to take the necessary decision to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So at one level, there's the IPBES, that is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, of which I used to be the founding chair of this new platform. I graduated early this year after a 3-year stint. It was not a holiday. It was really tough because this advisory body is not science in particular. It's really political because you're advising member states in the UN, 193 of them. I remember the day after I quit as the founding chair on the Monday. I woke up, I felt that a big rock has been lifted off my shoulder. So it's very challenging. And another one is the Secretary General, UN Secretary General Scientific Advisory Board, and also some of the others. What we are trying to say here, for a long time, the academics thought they didn't matter. Even if they matter, their voice were not heard. It's very recently, and that is because of the success of the IPCC. Others would follow, the UNSG Scientific Advisory Board, and also IPBES. Because the policymakers, governments needs to make policies, programs, strategies based on solid scientific evidence. And that evidence can only be given by us, by people who had done the research. So just to remind you again, your research is important for publication, but we hope eventually it has relevance to formulating better policies. So in Malaysia, the apex of that is the Office of the Science Advisor to the Prime Minister. I report to him directly. And some of the things that we do would be down there where I will advise him on priorities of S&T for national development, investment for R&D, human capital for S&T, encouraging S&T-based innovation in business, and promoting science diplomacy. Another area which I think academics should examine more. It is very important also. It's not just political diplomacy, but science diplomacy. So there are three forms of science advice that I experience. One is deliberate advice, second, informal advice, and third, rapid advice in emergencies. Deliberate advice is when you have to position the role of science to the economy. For Malaysia, is the well-being in the palm oil industry, electrical and electronics, and the environment. And also how pollution, floods, and landslide can be factored in to be mitigated through science. Secondly, science advice is not the purview of only one ministries. Like in Malaysia, we have a Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, but the issue of science also relates to the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Health, Ministry of International Trade, and on and on. So here, the role of the science advisor is to be the honest broker and facilitate those different interests from different ministries. And of course, there's also the need to engage and promote public-private collaboration. At the end of the day, we need to demonstrate impacts of STI on people's well-being. Without the advances in technology, for instance, we won't be sitting fairly comfortably in this room. There's a very simple example of the role of science towards the well-being of people. In a country like Malaysia also, we were lucky because there is focused commitment on the part of the Prime Minister to have a target for socioeconomic development. He called it the new economic model, which was introduced in 2009 when he came into office, and it's predicated by three pillars. We want to be a high-income country. In fact, the target is to be an industrialized country by 2020, where our minimum income is about 15,000 US. With some hard work, and I'm sure some of the academics here have been trained in Malaysia, we are aiming to have that minimum level in 2020. Right now, our income is around 10,000 US dollars a year. Secondly, again, in Malaysia, as a multiracial, multi-ethnic group of people with different levels of well-being, we need to be inclusive to make sure no one is left behind. And thirdly, in a finite world, we need to profess sustainability. So those are the three pillars of the new economic model. The challenge is how could science and technology contribute towards achieving those goals of the new economic model. And for that, the Prime Minister a few years ago has introduced this Science to Action initiative, where he looked at science that could give value to our economic well-being. And in that Science to Action initiative, we are dissecting the problem into three relevant themes. One, science to governance. This is really to streamline the governance of science so that it won't be duplicative, it won't be siloed among the different ministries. Secondly, science to well-being, to ensure that the people's interest is taken at heart, in particular, trying to strengthen the capacity building of young Malaysians. Notwithstanding our progress, our mastery of the science subject, in particular the so-called STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, is not a source of pride, really. So Malaysians are quite backwards in the mastery of STEM. So one of the things is to have more science students in the school. And along those lines, we are looking at some models which Dato' Lee here is very familiar with, how science education could be made more interesting by having a curriculum that is based on critical thinking and hands-on. But finally, also in the Science to Action initiative is the component of science to industry. Because science cannot only be done by government, the private sector has to come in. So there are public-private partnership in this particular initiative. This is one example in which the Prime Minister requested government bodies to be streamlined, so there wouldn't be any duplication or the siloed mentality. To make a long story short, in terms of the governance in Malaysia, how science advice is factored in, at one time the Prime Minister has to chair 9 science-related councils over here in the middle. But now it is collapsed that he would chair only one umbrella science council, and that is the National Science Council, to be complemented by another council which is drawn from international experts. And Professor Muhammad is one of the members of the Prime Minister's Global Science and Innovation Advisory Council. So with that structure, at least as a country, we are quite placed, you know. Many of these things are not new to industrialized countries like the US, the UK, Australia, or Canada. But for developing countries, it's still quite foreign. But I would argue that this is really a very good thing to do. Science advice also can be in the realm of informal advice. So this is where controversial issues would crop up from time to time, like the issues of GMOs, stem cell cloning, balance between conservation and development, or even when the Malaysian plane MH370 was missing in the Southern Ocean. There's a lot of science and mathematics in that, you know. And previous models have forecasted, but we haven't found the plane yet. Pieces of it are found on the coast of Africa, for instance. But there's a lot of science going into this tragedy. Science is also implicated in the response of the government towards emergencies. This is one example how science and technology is used to mitigate the big flood. In fact, this is a request from the Prime Minister for me to organize the S&T input. And after a lot of deliberation among scientists in the universities, in the research institute, government research institute, and the public sector, you can see that there are a lot of examples of the S&T response, to things like disaster. And here it ranged from some of the issues that we discussed, the role of big data in disaster prevention or mitigation, the use of advanced flood walls, robotics, and what have you. Here's another example. But what is also quite intriguing, maybe not here in Southeast Asia, the burning of peat swamps by small farmers and sometimes renegade oil palm plantation created this haze. This is smog in the atmosphere, which would stay there for months, And here again, science come in by the PM asking for scientific advice on how to overcome the haze. But just to sum up and almost to conclude, there are three prerequisites of convincing public policymakers. And I would share this with academics here. For your advice to be taken seriously, you must have the credibility. Number one is the credibility. And that credibility only applies if you have professed to be a good academic, as a professor or associate professor. Secondly, you must have relevance, The problem to be addressed would have to be relevant to your country. Maybe here would be the case of desertification, how science can help alleviate that. And finally, it should be legitimacy. The legitimacy means acceptance by the stakeholders, in this case, political leaders and policymakers. You must have these three prerequisites of convincing policy makers. So let me conclude by addressing two issues which are of importance to us all. One is the challenges of sustainable development. This is the $64 million question which has been agreed in the summit, the development summit last year, in which 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, are being addressed, ranging from water, energy, poverty alleviation, and so on. This is one thing that academics everywhere should be concerned with. It's not only the government officials, because you, through your knowledge, has a role to play. Secondly, something which is very near to the roles and function of future university, and that is the fourth industrial revolution, or Industry 4.0, that we have come a long way from the first time through steam and water power, electricity and assembly lines, to computerization. What is intriguing about Industry 4.0 is the convergence of all the knowledge disciplines, into a mix which is transsectoral, multidiscipline. So if you think in future university you have less relevance to the challenges of sustainable development, you are wrong. In fact, there's a convergence of ICT, nanotechnology, biotechnology, synthetic biology, the whole work, robotics, you know. So it has come full circle. Secondly, this revolution also, the globe be a neighborhood. You can pick up the phone here in Khartoum. I can call my wife and children in Kuala Lumpur, which is about midnight now. But right here. So it's the power of knowledge, you know, which is obligated that you do it. So that's Coach, thank you so much for this quite a challenging room with all its, but it's fine.